folks. Welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society. For those of you that I haven't had the chance to chat with and meet, I'm Ben Spagan. I'm with the JES team here. And it's such a delight to be here on the fifth day of a week-long residency that we've had. Before we get started, who's attended at least one of the other lectures, The Founding in Perspective from Dr. J. Cost? That is great. Who has been to at least two more? Three more. Wow. I mean, I'm not going to go all the way, but really, I think you all should give yourselves a round of applause. This kind of work does not happen without you. It doesn't happen without your thoughts, and you're asking for something like this. An important part of what we do, aside from listening to some of the best and brightest throughout the region and the country and beyond, is listen to you all. And this is something that folks were asking for, the opportunity for a deeper, more sustained learning opportunity to really dive into something with an expert. And so we've been so grateful to see you here for so many of these. This is the second residency of our summer schedule. We had one earlier toward the beginning of July. How many of you, one more show of hands, that's it, I'll stop with the quizzing. Afterwards, there is going to be a test though. No, I'm just kidding. Just one more. If we were to do these again next summer, how many would be interested in us continuing the residencies? That's great to hear. Okay, I did lie. I'm going to ask you one more hand. If we did this more than just summer, would you be interested in these in the spring as well? That's really helpful for us because my curiosity is whether to keep this as a fun summertime thing or it's fun can't be contained and we should spread it out into the spring. So I think I'm hearing that. So I'll take that back to my team. Of course, I do want to acknowledge this is not it for us. We have more programming coming up. In fact, we have several programs still yet ahead that we are looking at with the rest of the summer schedule. Starting next week, we have generative AI, artificial intelligence, and jelly beans. What do those two things have in common? We'll find out at 6 o'clock at the Lincoln Community Center in Fairview. Dr. Leanne Forbes, professor at Gannon University, will be lecturing on that. We also next week, our final community conversation lunch of the year will be happening on Wednesday. We'll get a chance to learn from, I believe we have, right, Mary Beulah, Erie Together, effectively engaging the community to address local priorities. A reminder with that being a lunch program, if you do want to partake in the lunch, just ask that you register early and note that so that we can order appropriately for that. Appreciate you showing up for the lunches and being with us. So I will take I will take less time today introducing today's speaker, as it appears many of you are quite familiar with him at this point because you've attended these. I will make a note that all week we have been offering two of his excellent many books for sale. One, James Madison, who we're going to learn about today, and the other, The Price of Greatness. What is The Price of Greatness? $31 up front, in fact, if you want to purchase that book. I'm also told that if you want to purchase both books together, that we are selling them at a discount for a bundle. So the other book that we have, of course, is James Madison, who we'll focus on today in the founding perspective. I've really enjoyed this series because, one, I think this is a great way for us to think of, in some ways, a prerequisite to what we're going to hear a lot about next year, 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we as a nation will be talking about that, celebrating that, and wondering what it meant then, what it means now, and how things have changed in between. And of course, looking back to look forward. And here's a chance to get inside of the minds of, to walk with for a moment, the founders. You've heard me say this before, perhaps at programs. I do absolutely love when I get a chance to say, and now join me in welcoming somebody who literally wrote the book on it. So here, someone who literally wrote a book on James Madison to take us inside of Madison's head for the founding perspective. Please join me in issuing the warmest of Erie, Pennsylvania and JES welcomes to Dr. J. Cost.
All right. right, good to be back with everybody today. Happy especially to be talking about James Madison. It's probably not a surprise that he's my favorite founding father. There's a lot of reasons I like him. Some of them is, he was a guy, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but he was a guy you often didn't see coming. He was 5'4", he was very quietly spoken. He was could sort of blend into a room a little bit, but he was a formidable political character. Throughout the week, I've spent a lot of time yesterday, Thursday, in the Jefferson lecture, and then Wednesday in the Hamilton lecture, sort of going over the differences between the Jeffersonian Republicans and Hamilton and the Federalists. Madison is involved in all of those, but since I've already talked about that a lot, I want to focus today particularly on Madison's constitutional thought. Now, that being said, if you have questions about Madison's role in the politics of the 1790s or even his presidency, which I've talked about a little bit as well, we can get into that during the Q&A session. But today I want to focus more on the writing and the drafting of the Constitution and Madison's role in creating the document. So like I said, Madison is, in his own day, is not really all that famous during most of his life, or in the case of Alexander Hamilton, we might say infamous, right? Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and so in many respects was the obvious choice for the leader of the Jeffersonian Republicans. His image and his reputation was sort of synonymous with the Declaration. George Washington was obviously one of the most famous individuals in the entire Western world by the time of the founding. John Adams, probably less so, but certainly had a national reputation. People would have known who he was, having served overseas and having been on the committee to propose the Declaration and being an early advocate for revolution. Madison is a little different because, of course, Madison's great contributions come at the Constitutional Convention, which we know about today, but the Constitutional Convention was done in private. There was a strict code of secrecy. It was closed to visitors. The curtains were drawn. Nobody was to talk about anything. The proceedings were done in private, and the document that was published did not have, citations at the bottom of whose idea was what. So it was hard to know exactly what Madison's role was. Now, we know a great deal about what Madison's role is now because Madison, go figure, took very detailed notes. And when I say very detailed notes, I mean excruciatingly detailed notes. We owe so much to Madison just as a stenographer, as a diligent stenographer, to know what the different arguments at the convention were. There were a couple people who took brief notes or who took notes while they were there and they left. Madison was there for every session. And Madison would take notes in shorthand and then go back home or back to his lodgings in the evening and write them out. So we know a great deal about what actually happened at the Constitutional Convention. I mean, by the way, anytime you ever see a book in the library or at Barnes & Noble talking about the Constitutional Convention, dramatizing it, really what they're just doing is rewriting Madison's notes. I mean, that's how important they are. Right? However, those notes were not released until after he died. He left them with his wife, Dolly, so she could publish them and earn an income from them. And he wasn't celebrated as the founder of the Constitution until the 1830s. It wasn't until, maybe 1829. It was Jared Ingersoll who toasted him that. But this is well into his retirement and almost into his 80th year. And the Federalist Papers, which he's also famous for, were similarly anonymous. They were published under the pseudonym Publius. And so, by the way, it wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that a political scientist named Douglas Adair figured out who actually wrote which ones. There's a problem, and Hamilton did not do this out of malice, so I want to be very clear. But at one point towards the end of his life, Hamilton made a list of the Federalist Papers that he authored, and he claimed authorship of a number that Madison had actually written. And so if you ever, maybe sometime you'll find an old volume of the Federalist Papers, they'll say Hamilton or Madison, that's why. Right. Now in 2025, we know know which ones that he wrote, and so we know what his intellectual contribution is. But that's a relatively recent development. So Madison is, in a lot of respects, a kind of a behind-the-scenes player in a lot of the politics of this period, especially because he's not much of a glory hound. Madison is not really very interested in claiming credit for things. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't have vanity. He does have vanity. He is inclined, people who disagree with him, he has a tendency to ascribe bad motives to them. He tends to be very bitter when he loses political battles. So there is a vanity there, but his particular vanity was not really one in desiring credit for things. Madison, for instance, is happy to slot in behind Thomas Jefferson in the 1790s. Madison was the first one to wage the sort of political battle against Alexander Hamilton in 1790 in Congress as Hamilton is proposing his program. But as Jefferson comes back into government and becomes aware of what's going on, Madison is prepared to sort of slot into a number 2 spot with him. So there's not really a great deal of vanity. And I don't think it is right to say that he had a lifelong ambition to be president. Right? His physical characteristics also make him seem, frankly, wimpy. He was only 5'4" and he weighed 105 pounds. And so if you ever have occasion to go to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, on the second floor of that building, they have a room where they sort of recreate the signing of the Constitution, and they have statues of the men who signed the document and then the men who didn't sign the document. And Madison is standing next to George Washington, and the statue, I was really struck when I saw it for the first time a couple years ago, because, it's one thing to see on paper 5'4", 105 pounds, but when you look at his statue, he looks like a boy. I mean, he looked like a boy. And if it wasn't for his receding hairline, he looked very boyish, right? He also has a very soft voice. He's not very loud. So he doesn't this is a problem for him professionally, by the way, because we've talked about this in the past that, at this time, Madison turns 21 in 1772. He comes home from college. What are the 2 things that a well-educated young man such as himself are capable of doing? Going before the bar or going to the pulpit? Well, you have to have a voice for both of those, and he doesn't really have much of a voice. And as a matter of fact, before the revolutionary sentiment really kicks into overdrive in 1773-74, he sort of is having an existential crisis. He goes to Princeton. He's very accomplished at Princeton. He comes home, and he ends up being a tutor to his half dozen or so younger siblings. He doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. He's not especially impressive at large gatherings. There's sort of, gossipy women in Philadelphia would write during the Continental Congress meeting because after the Franco-American Alliance, the French come into Philadelphia, and the French like to party, and so there's like good parties in Philadelphia that lots of people attend. And I don't remember who said it, but basically one of the women at these parties had recorded in her memoirs that Madison was kind of a drip, and he was very, very funny and witty in personal, intimate gatherings, and he had a very bawdy sense of humor, like a really kind of a naughty sense of humor. He had some poetry of his from college survives, and it is terrible poetry. It's just really genuinely awful, but it's also kind of like off color, which I think is funny. He was prone to illness. He had bouts of seizures. He had a series of panic attacks. Nobody knows what's short. Lynn Cheney, in her biography about 15 years ago, suggested he might have been prone to epilepsy. I'm not particularly persuaded of that claim. It's possible. Might have just been panic attacks. He had some bad panic attacks when he was in college. Like, the impression I got from reading the letters was that he worked himself sick, something like that. So, and he was also prone to hemorrhoids, which is really uncomfortable in the 1780s, you can imagine, right? He was convinced as a young man that he'd die young. He was convinced. This is very ironic because he ends up being the last of the founding fathers. He lives all the way until 1836. He's the last person to sign the Constitution. He lives through not just the Virginia dynasty of Jefferson himself and Monroe, but also through most of Jackson's presidency, and he lives through the nullification crisis. And as an old man, he's writing letters opposing John C. Calhoun's doctrine of nullification. His physical traits mask really impressive political skills and really impressive analytical skills, intellectual skills. So he's not a great orator like Patrick Henry, and he's not a great warrior like George Washington. He is not very good at writing. I mean, he's a good writer. He can write a lot, and his writing conveys a deep level of thought, but he struggles to turn the kinds of phrases that Jefferson could do almost preternaturally. Madison's skills are, I want to say they're much more practical, and they are formidable. He had an intuitive grasp of what I'm calling legislative psychology. Any kind of deliberative body, there is a kind of collective mood that it often has, and Madison was very good at intuiting what that mood was and pushing when it was time to push and pressing the brakes when it was time to press the brakes. He avoided personal grudges for the sake of getting work done. He was willing to work with previous political opponents. That's not the case with Hamilton as we move into the 1790s. But again, if you've been here this week, you can appreciate, I'm sure, the extent to which there was not really a lot of common ground between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists. But outside of things like that, Madison could put aside disagreements. He was as smart as anybody we've discussed this week. On just sheer brain power, he is the equal of Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams. Washington is sort of operating on a different level, on a different wavelength. He is as intelligent as they are. But Madison's intelligence is dedicated more towards focused problem solving. Right? We saw, for instance, with Adams, Adams is in Europe and sits down, takes pen to paper, and begins the process of writing this 3-volume analysis of the history of republics since the beginning of ancient Greece, right? That's what Adams is doing. Thomas Jefferson is writing letters about the immorality of debt and thinking about what it means to make somebody happy. What does it mean to live a well-lived life? Madison is not thinking about questions like that to that extent. Madison is more focused on problem solving. Madison's career in politics is directed from the very beginning towards, I want to accomplish this task, how do I go about doing it? So for instance, even as a young man at the age of 25, he's in the Virginia Constitutional Convention that writes the Virginia Constitution. He wants to get something in there for religious liberty. That was an early priority. How do I go about doing that? And later on in Congress, I want to strengthen Congress. How do I go about doing that? So Madison's efforts are always pointed in the direction of whatever project that he's on. So, and a good illustration of that would be like if you look at, say, John Adams in 1787, he's in London writing this, really kind of ridiculously nerdy, out there disquisition on the history of republics. Madison is focused on getting the Constitution written, and then he's taking detailed notes on everything. Right? That's how Madison's mind worked. It's very problem-solving oriented. And the problem Madison encountered was, and it's a problem that we've been talking about this whole week, how do you make republics work? Especially the kind of democratic republic that the United States is in the process of creating. All right, now we've seen here, Adams is sort of on the outside of that. We talked about Adams on Tuesday. Adams wants to tamp down on the democratic element out of his fear of oligarchy and aristocracy. Hamilton's solution is to, empower the natural aristocracy, to sort of cushion them from the masses. Jefferson is not really worried about a popular sovereignty. Madison, like Jefferson, recognizes the necessity of popular sovereignty. Madison's definition of a republic is not one in which power is shared. It is that all power flows from the people. So Madison, in principle, is committed to that idea. But unlike Jefferson, he recognizes that this is a problem, that democracy, or what we today would call democracy, needs to be managed. And unlike Adams and unlike Hamilton, Madison's great job is to find a solution to the problem of democratic republics without violating the basic principle of democratic republics, which is popular sovereignty. That's his great task. He serves continuously in the Continental Congress from 1780, 81, 82, 83. And by the way, there's a number of reasons. So the subtitle of my book is James Madison, America's First Politician. There's a number of reasons that I chose that. But one of them is that Madison, from a very early age, is actually a professional politician. Sort of like the archetype that we take for granted today, people who do this for a living. A lot of people who are in government are also managing plantations, like Jefferson, or managing businesses like Robert Morris, or they need to get back to work because they've run out of money, like Alexander Hamilton. Madison doesn't have any of those issues. And the reason why is that he's living at his parents' house. So if you have any kids or grandkids who, never quite, grew up and got their own place, neither did James Madison, right? His father actually lives until 1801. And it's only in his father's death, and by the way, his father was James Madison Sr., right? So James Madison Sr. owns Montpelier until 1801. Madison is living there. And so what that enables him is that his father is able to provide him with an income, and because he doesn't have his own home to manage, he can be in in Philadelphia full-time. This was one of the reasons, by the way, that he gets promoted so quickly, because previous to working in the Continental Congress, he was in what was known as the Virginia Privy Council advising the governor, which he likewise did full-time. So he's just committed full-time. He's not married. He doesn't marry until 1795. So he's saying there was a girl, her name was Kitty Floyd, that he was in love with in 1780, 81, but she jilted him, and then he marries Dolly. So he's a bachelor, sort of just committed to politics. And he sees in Congress, 1781, 82, 83, he sees in Congress just how inept Congress is. He arrives in Congress at one of the worst moments in the war. The public finances are a disaster. Benedict Arnold betrays the country. South Carolina falls, and meanwhile, Congress is just a squabbling mess. And Madison intuits two problems. Right? One is that the state governments are irresponsible. The state governments are not paying their requisitions, or in other words, they're not giving the Congress money. The Continental Congress does not have the power to tax. It needs money from the states. The states aren't giving it money, or if they do give it money, they earmark the money for certain expenditures. Other things they do, they're not supporting the Army, or when they do support the Army, like New Hampshire would earmark funds for New Hampshire service members in the Army, which just creates a terrible effect on the esprit de corps, right? So Madison is aware of the irresponsibility of the states and that Congress is not able to do anything. But here's the problem. We talked about this on Tuesday with Adams. John Adams told us that these state governments are the pinnacle of human achievement in government, right? Adams argued that republics where power is divided between the one, the few, and the many are the best forms of republics. So why are these state governments so irresponsible? How is it possible? And indeed, what does this say? Because this is the other thing to bear in mind too here, is we take for granted today in 2025 that democracy, as we define it, is the only normative form of government in the world. If your country is not a democratic country, then your power is illegitimate. That's the common consensus today in 2025. In 1780, 81, 82 is far from the common consensus. The Americans are trying something new. And importantly, it seems in a lot of respects not to be going that well, right? It doesn't seem to be going that well. The governments are acting, behaving allegedly behaving irresponsibly. And so this sort of raises this question, like, what do we do about this? And this is where we get a lot of Hamilton's response, which is we have to immunize the elite government officials from the masses because the masses are irresponsible. We have to push that immunization almost to the point that we begin to look like a monarchy. But Hamilton is struggling with this question too. Could it be that the American experiment in republicanism had fundamentally gone awry? Could it be that a democratic republic can't work? Could it be that you do need something closer to what Adams wanted, only to go further? That a republic requires a king. It requires the rule of the aristocracy in conjunction with the people. These are questions that are legitimate questions to be asking in the 1780s. And in a lot of respects, it does not look like democratic republics are all that great of an idea. Like I said, does there have to be more conscientious blending of the elites and the masses, like the Roman Republic? And this problem persists even after the war. As a matter of fact, the crisis of the war had given Madison and his allies in Congress, which included at the time Hamilton, had given them a political sort of leverage to push for reforms, right? Especially to get a tax. They were desperate to get Congress an independent source of revenue, and they came close a couple times. But ironically, the defeat of Cornwallis in October of 1781, his defeat at Yorktown ends up being, ironically, bad for the Continental Congress because it eliminates the sense of crisis. And as we move on into the 1780s, things seem not to get better. Right? Shays' Rebellion, we talked about that with George Washington on Monday. This is a rebellion of impoverished farmers in western Massachusetts who begin taking up arms against the local government, and they begin seizing courthouses. Now, I should add, too, the crisis in the sense of calamity about Shays' Rebellion. It's important to understand, like nowadays, for instance, when you interface or you interact with the government, oftentimes you just do it on your phone. Like I prepay my taxes, I have my IRS app, I pay my taxes on my phone, right? But in the 1780s, where you interfaced with the government was at the courthouse. That was where you paid your taxes, that was where you voted, that was where you served in jury duty, that was where the government met the people. And so for the Shays rebels to be seizing courthouses means that for all intents and purposes, they're overthrowing the local government. And there's anxiety among the elites, and not just the elites, but anybody with a stake in society, anybody who is better than on the periphery, right? The periphery is very uncomfortable, but if you have a level of comfort, the chances are that you're looking at Shays' Rebellion with a certain measure of disgust and anxiety, right? Could republicanism work only with Hamilton? No. Or Adams? Do we need some kind of elitist check on democratic republics? Do we need some kind of outside power, right? There's the power or the motive force of popular sovereignty, but does it, if left to its own devices, does it just lead to anarchy and irresponsibility? And so therefore that democratic force needs to be checked with an aristocratic force or with a de facto king, which is what Hamilton was basically calling for. Hamilton basically wants an elective monarchy. Madison offers a different answer. And it's important, Madison's answer is important because the Constitution ends up working. And so the Constitution really, in many respects, answers this question at the time of the possibility of a democratic republic. It is, in a lot of respects, a proof of concept. No, this can work. This is a possible form of human government. It can be stable. It can produce prosperity. It does a reasonably good job of protecting justice and promoting the general welfare. It can work. And the reason that we have this proof of concept is the success of the Constitution. And the logic of the Constitution, more than anybody else, reflects James Madison's arguments and ideas that he was developing in the 1780s. And so where does Madison come from here? Well, he starts with a great deal of skepticism that I think is reflective of his education at Princeton, which was the College of New Jersey. His instructor there was John Witherspoon, who was a very serious Calvinist Presbyterian. Madison ends up being a deist, but he sort of inherits the Calvinist skepticism of human nature. Jefferson had great faith in the masses. Hamilton has great faith in the elites. Madison doesn't really have faith in anybody. So Madison, right off the bat, Adams's suggestion about balancing mixing estates, Hamilton's idea of the natural aristocracy, Madison's suspicious about all of these. He doesn't trust people to rule like that. He doesn't trust any group of people, really. Any group, party, or faction was liable to seize power for its own ends. It doesn't matter how much money they have, how much fame they have, whether or not they're included in the class of natural aristocrats. Factionalism is just embedded in human nature, right? We are inclined to put our own interests, however we define it, above and before the interests of the community. Moreover, we are often inclined not to be aware that we're doing that. So often, human beings will be convinced that they're speaking on behalf of the public good, when in fact what they really have done is just generalize their own sense of right and wrong. And Adams's alternative was not actually Republican, right? Adams understands this problem too, and Adams's solution to this is, well, you take the rich, you take the aristocrats, and you take everybody else, you force them to work together. The problem with this is it's not really Republican in Madison's understanding. If the rich have power in government that is not reflective of their share of the society, that's basically like the English House of Lords. That's not Republican in Madison's view. All power in a republic has to flow from the people. There can't be mixed estates in a true republic. And like I said, Madison doesn't think it works anyway. Because even then, Madison thinks the history, and Madison also, by the way, hated monarchy, just hated monarchy. As a young man, he said that the history of the British monarchy is a history of tyranny, which is, if you look at the history of the British monarchy, it's actually not all that, I mean, the monarch, for most of our lives was Queen Elizabeth, and she was just this nice old lady. But, that's really kind of an exception in the history of British monarchy. The history of British monarchy is a history of cruelty in a lot of respects. So this is a letter. I'm going to read to you a quotation from a letter that Madison wrote to George Washington in the spring of 1787. So this would be about 2.5 months before the constitutional, maybe more like a month and a half before the convention really gets going. So I'm going to read this to you, and I want you to, if you find it difficult to follow along with Madison's writing, that's not on you, that's on him. He inherited as a young man some bad habits when it comes to writing. And one of the things that he is really committed to in his writing is precise argumentation. And the problem is often that he sacrifices eloquence or even readability for precision. So I'm going to read this, and then I'll sort of translate Madisonese into English for you here, okay? So he says, the great desideratum, that's just a fancy word for need or the great necessity. The great desideratum, which has not yet been found for Republican government, seems to be some disinterested and dispassionate umpire in disputes between different passions and interests in the state. So in other words, what Madison is getting at here is what a Republican government needs is somebody to call the balls and strikes. We talked about this earlier in the week. Somebody to say, here's a faction that wants one thing, here's a faction that wants another thing, here is the solution that secures justice and promotes the good of the whole community. Somebody who is not part of either faction, disinterested umpire. Right? The majority, who alone have the right of decision, have frequently an interest, real or supposed, in abusing it. Okay, so what does he mean there? Well, the problem in a purely democratic government, like for instance, let's suppose this room we declare ourselves the Republic of the Jefferson Society, and we're going to be a pure democracy, okay? So we take a vote, and this side has more people than that side, so this side is the majority, and the majority decides, this side decides to take all of your stuff. Sorry. In a pure democracy, there's nothing to stop this side from stealing the property of that side, right? Even though that is clearly a violation of justice and clearly not good for the whole community. This is the problem with democratic republics, because power is vested in a majority, and the majority is often has a real or supposed interest in abusing it. Right? This is the great problem with democratic republics. So one solution is a monarch, right? You put the monarch above, and I'm King J the First, and I decide that you guys can't do that, right? So I'm above. But Madison goes on. In monarchies, the sovereign is more neutral to the interests and views of different parties. But unfortunately, he too often forms interests of his own, repugnant to those of the whole. In other words, what happens in this scenario is that King J the First decides that he's just going to steal all of your stuff and keep it for himself. This is the problem with mixed estates. Madison thinks that democratic republics are a problem, but that also monarchies are a problem. And Madison doesn't really have a lot of respect for Adams's solution either. All right, so the problem is that nobody, no group, no interest has sufficient dispassion. Nobody is actually outside. Nobody has the God's eye view to look down and say, these people are right, these people are wrong. Now, we have that with juries, but we can't have that in politics. We can't do that in politics. So the periodic enlightened statesmen like Washington, right? Madison, obviously a guy like Washington, there are certain noble souls, maybe as they would say, noble souls who are capable of that kind of enlightenment. But as Madison points out in Federalist 51, I think that they're often not at the helm, right? That's not how you sustain a republic. If you have some heroic noble once in several generation soul, that's great, but you're not going to have people like that. So who will be the umpire? Madison's answer is, let's make the process itself the umpire. That's his great solution. And it's really brilliant. It's really brilliant. In building out this idea, he revolutionized the typical thinking about Republican politics. All right, so that's Madison's brilliant idea, is to make it so that there is no umpire. And maybe a way to think about this, it's sort of a crude analogy a little bit, but a pickup basketball game oftentimes does not have an actual umpire, right? Kids playing basketball at the park. But there can be a certain level of fairness there if one group decides to take its ball home, or if one group is being too aggressive, the other ones don't come back, that the process itself can, under certain circumstances, be self-regulating. And that's what Madison is looking for here. And to do this, he's got to go against, he offers a political theory that goes against this guy. That's the Baron Montesquieu, who was a French historian, sociologist, just a brilliant thinker, who in 1748 argued he does this sweeping history of governments. It's called the spirit of the laws, so the sweeping history of laws, and argues that each system of law has a certain spirit, and the spirit of a democratic republic is virtue, right? In other words, like, citizens are capable of that level of dispassion because they give themselves up to the public good. That was Montesquieu's idea. This requires a small geographical sphere, economic simplicity, not too much acquisition of wealth, and an emphasis on public virtue, right? So almost sort of like a local community like this, almost, where everybody is focused on, doing right and giving of themselves to the community. Montesquieu's argument is that's how you sustain a democratic republic, because the majority, in this view, will have the power to do whatever it wants, but it will be internally restrained because there is an emphasis in the community on building up virtuous citizens. So sort of like ancient Sparta is kind of an example of this. The Americans, this is the trick, though, and this is Madison's point. The Americans had tried this, right? I mean, obviously the 13 states are a tad larger than Sparta, but these are certainly fair tests of this small Montesquieuian system of small republics, and it really hadn't worked. There's a widespread sense that the flush of civic pride, intensity, and virtue that had sort of sprung up during the Revolution, there was widespread anxiety into the 1780s that it was fading. There's a widespread sense that the states were acting more selfishly. States were dividing along property lines internally, and they were antagonizing one another in commerce. They also ignored the Treaty of Paris. One of the stipulations of the Treaty of Paris was that the American state governments would not attack or appropriate the property of loyalists. Problem is, the loyalists made for easy political targets. So the states did that in violation of the Treaty of Paris. And the British said, oh, well, that's very interesting that you're doing that. Guess what? We're not leaving the Northwest. Right? You're violating the treaty. We're going to violate the treaty. So there had been a pretty good test of Montesquieu's ideas And it doesn't seem to be working, right? This is sort of the foil. So what's Madison's solution? Madison's argument is that we have to scale up. The problem that Montesquieu had is that he's thinking about republics that are too small. Small republics are homogeneous. That makes it possible for one faction to dominate the others. That's the problem with small republics. Small republics are, now, whereas previously Montesquieu's argument would be that small republics is a way to transcend the problems of faction, right? Because you're raising up a virtuous citizenry, you're keeping close watch on the government, so you're not getting like cliques in the government and people are dispassionate. Madison argues, no, he's exactly wrong. The problem is that small republics are not only do small republics not get rid of factions, but small republics are homogeneous enough that one faction can get in charge. Like in Virginia, the Anglicans had been persecuting the Baptists because in the previous decade, in the 1770s, because they were the majority. They could do whatever they wanted. And more recently, in Massachusetts, the creditor class, the merchant class in Boston had taken control of the state government and had rewritten the laws of the state. Right? The opposite happened in Rhode Island, where the impoverished debtors get in charge and basically force creditors to take huge haircuts on their investments. Right? So this is the problem here, is that if one group in a state amounts to 51%, in a democratic republic, they can do whatever they wanted. But in a state or polity where there is more diversity, a diverse polity, no faction can dominate the others. So, for instance, take religion. The Anglicans might have been a majority in Virginia, but nationwide, there is no religious majority. There's Anglicans, there's Quakers, there's Baptists, there's Congregationalists, there's all sorts of groups, right? So nobody has a majority on religion. Likewise, in, say, creditor-debit disputes, there's more balance there. There's different economic groups and factions, right? This is Madison in Federalist 10. He says, this is a long quote, I'll read it and break it down. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests comprising it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. In other words, a smaller society is going to have fewer factions. That's going to create the possibility for one to take charge. And also communication is a factor here as well. So a smaller republic, people who have similar interests are going to become more aware of the potential for an alliance, and so factions are going to be more likely to form. If you spread factions out over a country the size of the United States, it's going to take longer for those factions to form. So Madison goes on, and this is a famous quote starting here. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Right? This is the argument for the continental republic, for the big republic. This is like, a key sort of criticism of what the founders were trying to do was that you can't do democratic republics on this scale. It's too big. They have to be small. Madison's argument, which carries the day, is that no, actually large size is actually the strength of a democratic republic. Madison also revises this is another interesting thing that he does. So as you know, our system has checks and balances, right? Where, for instance, the president is able to veto the laws of Congress, but Congress can override it. The president is in charge of carrying on war, but Congress declares the war. There's all sorts of intermingling of powers. These are all old ideas as well. They go back at least to the ancient Roman Empire. And they were sort of bound up with the idea of mixed estates, or you have to give the aristocratic class the capacity to defend itself. You have to give the popular group the ability to defend themselves. So this idea of checks and balances is an old idea that is linked to mixed estates. Madison gets rid of the mixed estates notion and keeps checks and balances. He transforms it into a republican system. The point of the president, the Senate, and the House is not to have the one, the few, and the many represented, but to prevent factionalism within the government. So, the one, the few, and the many which is what these institutions were conceived of, now they all represent the people, right? But now we're going to give them a little bit of power, not all the power, to make sure that they don't abuse the power, right? So Madison is taking an old idea and he's reappropriating it for this democratic republic that's being built. The concurrence of the three entities, right? Get the three to go along, each of which is dependent upon the people, will make sure that justice and the general welfare are served, right? So what Madison is doing here is he's taking old ideas and reappropriating them, reimagining them. So this is Madison in Federalist 51. The great security against the gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. In other words, how do we stop one branch of government from grabbing all the power? We give the other branches of power the ability to play defense. The provision for defense must be in this, as in all cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. And this is the great Madison quotation. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. So Madison is taking, again, he's taking a classic idea, the mixing of the one, the few, and the many, and he's getting rid of these social distinctions. But he's keeping this idea of checks and balances to protect the structure of the government from being overrun by one group or faction within the state, right? It may, and this is another great line here that I just wanted to include this because it's great. Madison doesn't turn many great phrases, but he does have a real good one here. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? Here it is. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. So that's Madison's idea. If we have the right institutional structures around a democratic republic, we can make it work. We have to just find a way to control for factions in the broader society and ambition within the government itself. Now, what makes this so special is that these ideas are not just the sort of idle thoughts of a guy who's watching from the sidelines, right? Madison is not like John Adams. He's not in London. Madison is in the middle of things. The Constitution embodies both of these ideas in part because of Madison's political acumen or his skill. And this is where he's not just like a super brainy nerd. He's actually really good at politics. He's got a real intuitive grasp of things. And I'd mentioned at the beginning one of Madison's real skills is understanding legislative psychology. How do big bodies of groups of people, assemblies, how do they think? And so what he does is he devises a plan of government in his spare time. He brings it to Philadelphia early. He comes to Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention is scheduled to get away like the third week of May. It doesn't really get started until the very end of May. Madison shows up at the first of May or early in May. He coordinates with the other Virginians as they arrive. He touches base with the Pennsylvania delegation, and he proposes a plan. And on the first full day of business, again, Madison's not a vain guy. His plan, he doesn't propose it himself. He gives it to Edmund Randolph, who's the governor of Virginia. It was a smart move. And it wasn't called the Madison plan, it was called the Virginia plan, right? Now, why is that so brilliant politically? I mean, obviously it makes sense to give it to the governor of Virginia, right? What Madison does here is some real serious political science maneuvering. It's known as setting the agenda, right? If you've ever participated in committee setting, you know, everybody gets a vote, but the chair decides what you're going to vote on, right? That's the power to set the agenda, right? This is one of the reasons why, the Republicans, even though they have a narrow majority in the House, they're able to exercise such sweeping power because they get to decide what comes on the floor. See, the thing to bear in mind here is that when everybody shows up in Philadelphia, I mean, we know what they did, but they didn't know what they were going to do. They weren't sure exactly what is this convention going to do. And by the way, the actual mandate was just to revise the Articles of Convention, or Confederation. That was the original plan of government. But Madison's plan just completely deletes it, starts again. And so the power here, right, because you can imagine them starting, and so like, okay, well, what are we going to do to revise it? What do you think we should do? And you could imagine the conversation being focused on revisions and just tweaking at the margins. But like on the first full day of business, Edmund Randolph stands up and says, here, we have a plan. Let's talk about this. And that's what they do. It's something to talk about. And the plan reflects Madison's national logic and his ambitions. It oriented the delegates towards a national government. So this is Madison not simply being very smart, like book smart, and a really sharp political philosopher, but also as a practical politician was really formidable. And he also gives more speeches than almost anybody at the convention. Now, to be clear, he doesn't get everything he wants. There's compromises, and the one compromise he hates particularly is the Senate. Right? He wants a national republic, and for Madison, a national republic has to reflect national population. So as the more people a state has, the more House members it should have, but also more senators. That's Madison believes that the great safety of Republican government is in diversity, and the Senate is not going to be diverse. It's going to look like the old Continental Congress. But it was a deal breaker for the southern states. The small states. The small states basically came in and said, we're never going to agree to this. And the reality is if you look at a map of the United States of America in 1787, there were like 4 states that this was really good for. Madison's plan was good for Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina. You can't have a country if you don't get Maryland and Connecticut and New Hampshire and Delaware. You're not going to have a country. You're going to have like 5 different countries. So ultimately, they had to cut a deal. Madison doesn't like it. He also wants to give Congress a very broad grant of power. Actually, he says in his original draft, Congress should have the ability to do anything where the harmony of the Union is at stake or the states are judged by Congress to be incapable of dealing with the issue. And he wants to give Congress the ability to veto state legislation. In other words, kind of what Madison's original idea was is to return the states to the status of colonies, but not colonies to the king, but colonies to the national Congress that he wants to create. He doesn't get this as well. Really disappointed at first. He writes some really, it's really interesting to read the letters that he wrote to Jefferson in September of 1787 as the convention was wrapping up, and he is just absolutely angry. And he's just, this Constitution is not going to work. It's not going to answer the problems that we have. He finally he agrees it's better than nothing. But it's interesting because one of the reasons that Madison's Federalist essays are so persuasive and effective is in part because he thinks the anti-Federalists are exactly wrong. The anti-Federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, Congress is going to have so much power it's just going to wipe out the states. States are going to cease to exist. And Madison he believed personally that the Congress doesn't have enough power, that the states are going to overwhelm Congress. So Madison's Federalist essays are very, very effective because he really thinks that the anti-Federalists are exactly wrong. He thinks they've misdiagnosed it. All right, so he thought they were exactly wrong. So as if all of this was not enough, as I'm sure you know, the Bill of Rights is not actually in the original body of the Constitution. It's amendments. And there had been a suggestion from George Mason, who was a delegate from Virginia, towards the end of the proceedings, let's include a Bill of Rights. And they said, no, we don't want to do that. They were tired. They wanted to go home. They had some arguments against the necessity of a Bill of Rights. This ends up being a major political problem for them, though. Because when the Constitution is submitted to the states for ratification, a lot of people are like, hey, where's the Bill of Rights? Because state constitutions, for the most part, had bills of rights. Like the Virginia Constitution that Madison was involved in, one of the things that he did as a young 25-year-old was work on the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This was one of the things that these state governments did when they went back after independence and wrote their own constitutions. They included bills of rights. Where's our Bill of Rights? There's all sorts of questions and anxieties about the Constitution. And by the way, it's a very close-run affair. The Constitution is ratified, but relatively narrowly. Many people thought that the lack of a Bill of Rights was a key defect, right? Madison disagreed. Madison had a couple arguments against a Bill of Rights. One of them was, if you start enumerating our rights, future politicians are going to get the wrong impression that these are the only rights we possess. How do you go about actually enumerating our rights? Especially if you take the basic sort of idea of a contract theory that before government exists, we retain all of our rights. There's that. There's also like, well, there's a limited grant of power in the Constitution. So like, Congress, has the power to regulate commerce. There's nothing in there, Madison would argue, that suggests that Congress has the authority to restrict free speech anyway. So what are we worried about here? And Madison's other point, which I think is a fair one, which is that what good is, he called it parchment barriers. Oh, I have a paper of my rights. That's a piece of paper is not going to stop you from like a mob that wants to take your stuff, right? That's a piece of paper, parchment barriers are useless. The way you protect your rights is through a solid, sensible, strong organization of political power, which we've done here, Madison would argue, right? They want a Bill of Rights. Compromise emerges in Massachusetts with what is known as recommendatory amendments. So in other words, Massachusetts agrees to ratify the Constitution as is and then recommend to the first Congress various suggestions to change it. And South Carolina does that. New Hampshire does that, Virginia does that, New York does that, later on North Carolina does it. So what we get then is a ratified Constitution with, a couple hundred or so recommended changes. And it's these that become in part the basis for the Bill of Rights. Madison, when he is running for Congress in 1789, he flip-flops. He said, well, okay, I had been against a Bill of Rights, and he had argued, and this was not without merit, because a lot of the anti-federalists said, oh, well, there's no Bill of Rights, we need to have another convention and revise it. Madison was like, that's just a way to kill the Constitution. If we have another convention, we're going to not get anything done. Right. Well, now that issue's settled, Madison says, okay, a Bill of Rights, it can't do any harm, was his argument, if it's well written. And this is why, by the way, the 10th Amendment and the 9th Amendment are in there. The 9th Amendment specifically says, like, we have more rights than what's listed here. This is Madison's doing. It can't do any harm. And it can do a lot of good, right? It can do a lot of good because it can sort of set itself as a standard for state bills of rights which are defective, and also sort of give people a sense of the understanding of the importance of the bill of your rights, which, by the way, I think is the most critical and long-lasting achievement of the Bill of Rights. Like, we usually think that the Bill of Rights is defended by the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, and it doesn't have the power to tax. So what really is the thing that defends the Bill of Rights? I think it's the spirit of the people, right? I think it's the spirit. One of the things I like to tell my high school students when I talk about the Bill of Rights, but one of the things I really, I don't know if you've ever seen, have you ever seen the show Cops? Anybody ever seen the show Cops? Okay, so Cops is a show about, police officers on the beat, especially in Florida, right? When they arrest like Florida man. And like every down on his luck, drug-addled, meth tweaker Florida man gets manhandled by the cops, and what does he start doing? He starts immediately talking about his rights. You can't do that to me. I have rights. Now, oftentimes he's wrong on the actual merits of the point, but it is extraordinary, isn't it, how thoroughly soaked this entire community is by the notion of rights that people on the very margins of society are still not only aware of it, but are advocates for their own rights. I think that this has been, more than anything, the great achievement of the Bill of Rights, more so than its defense by the Supreme Court, I think. I think the great bulwark for our rights are the people themselves, right? So anyway, Madison takes these suggestions plus his own ideas, revises them into 12 proposals, which end up becoming 10. He didn't especially think it was necessary, like I said, but it wouldn't harm. And this is another point too. He felt like there was a widespread expectation. The public wanted this, a way to sort of tie a bow around the resolution to this great question, right, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, a way to resolve this dispute, give the moderate Anti-Federalists the Bill of Rights. It's not just a political win for them, it will create confidence in moderates that the new government actually respects their views. Like I said at the outset, Madison doesn't really have a grand psychological theory like Adams, right? We talked about Adams and like the psychological origins of the aristocracy. He doesn't have a moral philosophy like Jefferson or an economic system like Hamilton. His mind, I mentioned this I think yesterday, Madison's mind is more telescopic, right? Like you look through a telescope, you're going to see in great detail a very small area, right? That's not to say that Madison doesn't have opinions on bigger questions. And it's not to say that when he expresses those opinions, they're fine. They're not particularly novel. But Madison was so focused on specific political questions that his real novelty and his real novel ideas tend to be very focused on the problems at hand. He doesn't exactly invent a new approach to government. That's not what he does. His extended republic is a counterpoise to Montesquieu, right? So he's taking Montesquieu and flipping it on its head. He's not building something new. He's sort of taking the conventional ideas and turning them upside down. And his use of checks and balances is inspired by an ancient Roman historian named Polybius, right? So he's taking old ideas and he's reappropriating them. He reinvents these ideas. And this, I think, is the great achievement that he does, is that more than anybody else, he takes old ideas that were designed for systems of government that are not like ours, that are not democratic republics. He takes those and reappropriates them and revises them, and in that revision finds a way to make large democratic republic work. Gone are the one and the few, only the many remain. But he's going to pull the insights from those old forms of government in ways that can be utilized for this new project. So Madison is almost kind of a scavenger, right? Going and picking and choosing and finding things and taking them and putting them together in old things to make a new system. His vision also, I think this is another long-lasting consequence, right? His vision for an extended republic creates the intellectual grounds for the subsequent expansion of the United States into the continent. There was no great fear when California was admitted to the Union that it was too far away, it was too distant. The anxiety about California being admitted was the extent to which it would disrupt the sectional balance, right? But there was no anxiety, as far as I know, in 1953 when Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to the Union, that these places couldn't possibly participate in our system of government. Because there's just an assumption, it's an American assumption that we go big, right? Our republic is a large republic. That's a Madisonian idea. And also, diversity of views is a strength. Then the only impediment is logistics. Can they get to government on time? Because we can practically incorporate them into our society. Just because they live far away and they have different views, that's actually a good thing in our system of government. A diversity of views is a good thing, right? I think it also speaks to why we started in this country with a very narrow franchise, right? Just propertied white men. But now we've expanded it and our polity has become more diverse too. Because there's a conviction that Republican government, one of its great strengths is diversity. And he outlines a vision, and I think this is where Madison presents a challenge, I think, for liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats today in this kind of total, I'm calling it in the next slide, a Manichean good versus evil sort of view of politics now, where politics is almost kind of like a quasi-religious struggle. He offers an alternative vision of what politics is supposed to look like. Nobody should send their representatives to the seat of government expecting to get everything they want. All right, that's not the way it goes in the United States. You should expect every faction to get a meaningful say. And the final outcome we should expect to be a compromise that fairly accounts for the diversity of views. So politics is not a war, right? The extent to which martial rhetoric has just become part of our political discourse is really striking, right? We're going to take our country back. We're going to take our government back like it's territory that's been lost, right? Both sides do this, right? Both sides use all sorts of martial rhetoric. But that's not actually a very Madisonian idea of things. The more Madisonian idea is that government is a process process by which individuals and factions express their own views, other views are expressed, and through that mutual expression, common ground is discovered through a process of back and forth. Which is not to say that it's not messy and it's not, it's like, highfalutin debate like at the Oxford, the Oxford Union. It's not like that. It can be messy and nasty. This is America after all. But the point of politics is to find common ground and consensus. That it's not about, well, we have 51%, you have 49%, so we get everything and you get nothing, so too bad for you. Like, that's not the point of Madisonian Republican politics. Like I said, this is a good alternative to our Manichean politics of today. All right. And so, final quote, this is a quote from Charles Ingersoll. This is the first time, as far as I know, that Madison was referred to as the father of our country. And it was, by the way, one of the practices back in the 1800s was, at dinners and stuff, used to do elaborate toasts, and it was really an excuse to drink, right? Because you toast like 50 people, or you toast a dozen people, and every time, so that was a common thing. Anyway, so this is at a toast in Philadelphia. If Washington was the father of our country, Mr. Madison is entitled to be considered the father of that Constitution, by which it has accomplished eminent prosperity and power, without ever appealing to the passions, but always addressing the reason of his fellow citizens. This illustrious patriarch impressed as much, if not more, of his mind than that of any other on our now well-defined and established institutions. I think that's a very fair comment, and I think that, by the way, Ingersoll is writing before his notes revealed exactly the extent, and also his letters, and now we have a fuller sense of what exactly he was working on, and I think it is fair to say that he impressed as much, if not more, of his mind than any other on our now well-defined and established institutions. And I would say that the only person that we've talked about this week that had as much an effect on the creation of the Constitution as James Madison was George Washington. So he's very, very important indeed. So that wraps up my talk here. If you have questions, I would be happy to answer them. I can talk about Madison basically till the cows come home. So thank you very much, everybody.
Another excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, did the founders ever consider vetting people who would be candidates for president?
That is a very good question. And the answer is yes. I'm sure most of you are aware there's this weird little clause in the Constitution that the president and the vice president can't come from the same state. It's in there. It's sort of this vestigial organ. But there was actually really, to your point, there was a logic there. And the Electoral College gets a lot of criticism, and rightly so in a lot of respects, because it didn't work, it never worked. But the logic that they had in mind for the Electoral College is really interesting. So what they wanted with the Electoral College was they wanted somebody, either one of two people, either somebody who was widely acclaimed as the great man of the Republic, or somebody who could win like Congress, the consensus choice of Congress. We can't vest the deciding power in Congress, though, because then the president will just do whatever Congress wants. So the first round's got to go out to the people. And so the way they set this up was the Electoral College, members of the Electoral College, they don't get just one vote for president. They get two votes for president in the original. Now, this gets changed with the 12th Amendment. It goes from being two votes for president to one vote for president, one vote for vice president. The original system was two votes for president, but they couldn't be from the same state. So what are they thinking there? Their thinking is that state electors are going to be inclined to vote for somebody they know, somebody like a favorite son, okay? But they can't vote for two favorite sons. So the second vote has to be from somebody out there in the country, somebody with some kind of nationwide reputation. And the thinking was that second vote was going to account for the person with the great nationwide reputation. So in that sense, there was a vetting there. That was what the vetting was. The vetting was you have to vote for somebody who's not from your own state. And that was the idea. Yeah. Good question. That's a very good question.
Thank you for all of your wonderful presentations.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed them.
Thank you. My question is about the diversity with the great United States being so big, and I think that I understand that Madison is saying it's inevitable that there would be then many factions. So why are there only 2 factions?
That is a great question. And that speaks to why they were so thrown by parties. And it might seem, and I mean, a lot of people say that the existence of party politics demonstrates the problem with Madison's theory. This is sort of a side, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but parties are, generally speaking, seen to be inevitable in democratic republics. That parties just solve certain problems for office seekers. They impose a kind of rationality on politics that enables ambitious politicians to rise, and so they solve problems. But I would point out, though, that one of the interesting things about our parties is that they themselves are coalitional in nature. That the Democratic Party, for instance, has people who are predominantly interested in labor issues. It has people who are predominantly interested in LGBTQ issues, people who are predominantly in environmental issues, people who are interested in civil rights issues. And so the party reflects a broad collection, and the Republican Party has a similar attitude to it. Like, for instance, the Republican Party has evangelical Christians, and it also has conservative Catholics, and it has small business owners. So the parties themselves are very broad aggregations. And you can really sort of appreciate this during primary season. Because it's during like the presidential primaries, because there will be candidates who emerge that are really like, they have their angle is to win, like lock down the support of a certain group within the party, and then basically like from there build out their coalition. So like one of the interesting things is that usually in Republican politics, for instance, not so much in 2020, not so much in 2024, but in 2016, 2012, 2008, even in 2000, there was an evangelical candidate. Like, because the evangelical group is a specific faction within the party, and so you get like a Mike Huckabee or Rick Santorum, or go all the way back to 1988, it's Pat Robertson. Like, so the parties themselves are aggregations of factions, and the reason they have to be that way is for the sake of the presidency. The presidency forces all of the different factions in society to make as many alliances as possible to compete nationwide for the presidency, because there's only one presidential office. So if your faction, like the evangelical, like for instance, the evangelical, they might not like the agenda of the small business movement within the Republican Party, but they can't run their own candidate. If they run their own candidate, they're going to get nothing. So that is sort of the interesting thing about our parties, which is very unique from like a lot of European parties, or like if you follow like Israeli politics, like they have like dozens of parties. We just really have 2, but we have as many factions as they do. It's just that our parties are alliances among our factions.
Your book, The Price of Greatness, is one of the best history books that I have ever read.
Thank you so much. That's so kind of you to say.
I am a veteran. I am a property owner. I am a native-born citizen. I am a taxpayer. I am not able to participate in what I perceive to be the most important election in any election cycle, and that's the one that's held in May in Pennsylvania. I wonder if Mr. Madison would have an observation about me being denied an opportunity to select a moderate candidate from either political party today.
Well, I think that when Madison was politically active, the parties were still closed entities, in the sense that party nominations were sort of made among the gentleman elite of the party. I think that what you're reacting to is more the Jacksonian response to the problems of that system, that a closed system can produce candidates that are unappealing to the community at large. And I do think that, I will say this, so I'm sort of punting on the question, I apologize, but I don't think that we can read Madison with that level of specificity. But I do think that there has been a perennial and perpetual problem in this country going really far back to the problem of parties choosing candidates for office. And it is a problem that does not admit of, or has not, we have not spent as much time thinking about how do we choose our candidates than we did thinking about how do we do elections. And so I think that you're onto something here as well, which is that the primary system as it existed was meant to become more democratic in some ways, but it has now had the effect of producing candidates whose views are outside of the mainstream. And in Pennsylvania particularly, I think what you're referring to is the closed primary in Pennsylvania, right? Republicans and Republican, yeah. So that is a perennial problem. You know, it's something, I don't know, like Pennsylvania as a state is not really very reform spirited. We were slow to do women's suffrage, for instance. We had a political machine running this state. I mean, Roosevelt lost in 1932 in Pennsylvania because the Republican machine was so